anxiety equals loss. What is underneath all anxiety is the mental fear of some loss. This is true of every type of anxiety. In health anxiety, we're thinking about the loss of some bodily function. In financial anxiety, we're thinking about the loss of some sense of security. In interpersonal anxiety, we fear the loss of the positive regard from some person. In spiritual anxiety, we fear the loss of the positive regard from God Himself. In performance anxiety, we fear the loss of our own self-image as competent or successful. Underneath every anxiety, there is something we value, and we fear its loss in our mind. Note that the fear is located in the future. Recall that anxiety is about hijacking you into the future. That loss has not happened yet. Anxiety is about potential future loss. Now, the formula, anxiety equals loss, tells us that if we want to be like the psalmist and cooperate with God in investigating our anxious thoughts, then we should start by naming accurately that underneath loss that we fear. This kind of investigation, it involves some digging, some spiritual excavation, because sometimes the true loss that we fear, the loss that's the true seed of a given anxiety, it's deeper than what we might first identify. Let me share an example of this kind of digging. After my career as a church pastor had ended, I started my own consulting company serving nonprofits and government. Now, my company had been operating successfully for over a dozen years when COVID-19 hit. And when that crisis hit, I did feel an upsurge of anxiety. In my initial investigation into that anxiety, I thought I feared the loss of the company itself. I had sensed quickly that this crisis was going to cause enormous financial damage to my client base of nonprofits. And in a serious downturn, nonprofit budgets for consulting services like what my company provides, they're usually the first to go and the last to come back. So as I examined my anxiety in prayer, I did begin to sense there was something more underneath. It's true, I value my company very much, and I do fear losing it. But I asked myself this question: why do I value my company so much? Why do I fear its loss? Now, as a side tip here, asking yourself the question, why, it's a great method for this kind of investigation. If you fear the loss of something, ask God to help you get underneath, to get at the why. Why do I fear this loss? When I dug at this question, why, I realized that my idealized self was at stake. My company represented a way that I wanted the world to look at me, as a successful entrepreneur. After my failure as a church pastor, I had worked hard to become a successful entrepreneur, and that image to the world was important to me. Losing my company would mean losing that part of my idealized self. Well, that realization was getting deeper to the truth. But there's this dynamic in the spiritual life that I hope you're already familiar with. When you just know you've gotten to the core of something, God has a way of letting you know when you've arrived there. And I could sense in that investigation, well, I hadn't quite got there yet. And in reality, if I were being truly honest, I knew all along what I feared at my core. What was driving my anxious thoughts as a middle-aged man was actually not that different from what drove my anxious thoughts as a 7-year-old. As a 7-year-old, I was thinking, if my parents don't ever come home, who will take care of me? As a middle-aged man, I was thinking, if my company doesn't survive, what will take care of me? At my core, I feared the loss of provision. Now, let me emphasize that my most feared loss will not necessarily be the same as yours. This kind of deep investigation is a highly personal process. I most fear the loss of provision. My wife most fears the loss of being seen as competent. One of my best friends most fears the loss of belonging. Another friend most fears the loss of independence. Everyone has their own layers of feared losses. The anxiety equals loss formula only tells you to follow your fear of loss. It doesn't tell you how the layers are arranged. The only way to know for yourself is to pray the prayer of Psalm 139 and ask God to search you and to know your anxious thoughts.